Welcome, dear soul, to this quiet corner of the night, where the present gently releases its hold and time becomes soft and porous, like a distant fog that settles over a familiar landscape, now hushed and golden, inviting you to let go of the weight of the day and surrender to the slow rhythm of memory and dream. For here, beneath the calm surface of your breath, we begin a journey not hurried or harsh, but gentle and lingering. A passage through shadowed paths and forgotten fields, a story that once stirred the soil of a vast and restless land, and now waits, patiently to be felt again in the safety of stillness and the comfort of night. As you settle in, let your body grow heavy and relaxed. Feel the support beneath you, embracing your weight without effort. And breathe in slowly, as if drawing the scent of quiet leaves and distant summer rains deep into your chest. And breathe out even slower, letting every breath dissolve into the hush around you like mist over morning grass. As the muscles in your neck soften, the tension in your shoulders slips away. Your thoughts begin to stretch and blur like watercolor, bleeding gently into silence. Because this is your time now, a sacred pause where the past and the present meet, not in conflict, but in communion. A soft space to rest and listen, and drift deeper with every word that falls, like a leaf turning gently in the air before it touches the earth tonight. We travel far, and yet we stay still, for the road we take is inward. Winding slowly through memory and myth into the landscape of the United States long before sirens and steel, into a land where lantern light flickered through cabin windows and the wind whispered across endless plains, where voices rose in quiet song and the rhythm of hooves and wheels echoed through dusty crossroads, where life unfolded in the measured pace of planting and harvest, of letters written by firelight and prayers murmured at dawn. And yet even in this seeming stillness there was a tension beneath the soil, a quiet fracture forming like a hidden current pulling gently at the roots of a nation that did not yet know how deeply it would be tested. Close your eyes if you haven't already, or simply let them soften and blur as you listen to the hush between words, and feel your breath slowing again as the world around you becomes quieter still. And if you feel your thoughts drifting, let them go, gently, like petals on a stream, for everything you need is here now. In the rise and fall of your breath, in the warmth of this space, and in the quiet unfolding of this story that comes to you not with urgency, but with reverence, as if spoken beside a fire that has burned low and steady through the years. Its embers still warm, its glow still strong enough to cast soft light on faces long gone and paths long traveled. The story you will hear tonight is not one of heroes and villains, not of battles or conquests shouted through time, but of hearts divided, of voices yearning, of families torn, and communities reshaped, and yet told with calm and care, with the softness of evening air brushing against weathered wood, with the slowness of trains pulling into quiet stations at twilight, with the hush of candlelight over maps and letters and hopes unspoken. For this is the story of a country whose soul was pulled in two, and of the many souls who lived between those lines. Not as names in books, but as beating hearts, uncertain and human, and quietly brave. And if you'd like, you may share where in time or space you're listening from. Quiet offering in the vast calm of this night, connecting your present breath with the long and winding echoes of history. Not to be noticed or measured, but simply felt, like the wind that moves unseen among trees that have witnessed more than we can say. Because as you rest here tonight, you too become part of the listening, part of the remembering, part of the great stillness that allows old stories to return in gentle waves. Soft enough not to wake you, but just present enough to keep you company as you drift gently into sleep. So breathe again, slowly, fully, letting the quiet fill the spaces within you where tension once lived, and know that there is nothing to do now, nowhere to go, only this moment, this voice. This story unfolding like a field beneath the stars, stretching wide and slow and calm as the night deepens around us. And let your mind rest, let your heart soften, as we step gently into a time before the storm, into a place where silence and memory still hold hands, and where even the most distant chapters of the past can be heard. If we listen with stillness and kindness and a little imagination, let the journey begin. Then, not with noise, but with breath, not with fear, but with curiosity, not with urgency, but with ease. As we enter together the long quiet before the American Civil War, a silence filled with voices not yet raised, with decisions not yet made. With a tension that hums low like a cello in the dark, steady and soft, waiting not to disturb your rest but to hold it, to rock it gently as the story flows on and you drift deeper into calm and into sleep. Before the first cannonball soared through the morning air, before the smoke of battle clung to the fields and rivers of a trembling nation, the United States existed in a strange kind of stillness, a fragile balance held together by threads worn thin with contradiction and silence, where people moved through their days unaware, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that. Beneath the soil they walked and the laws they obeyed, something deeper was stirring, something that had been quietly waiting through years of compromise and avoidance, something that could no longer be pressed down without consequence, and in the hush of these early years. The seeds of division had already been sown, not in dramatic speeches or open rebellion, but in the quiet, persistent truths that lived in the everyday, in who had rights, who held power, and in who was allowed to dream. In those decades before war, life in America unfolded in 1,000 different ways depending on where you stood and who you were. On the sun-baked plantations of the South, where generations of enslaved people labored under a system as old as it was brutal, or in the narrow, soot-streaked alleyways of northern cities where industry was rising and ambition crackled in the air, or in the rolling frontier lands, where expansion pressed ever westward and the promise of opportunity came wrapped in hardship and displacement. And through all of this movement and growth, a question loomed quietly in the background like a storm on the edge of the horizon. Could a nation built on both liberty and bondage endure without choosing between them? The Constitution, brilliant and flawed, had offered a framework, but not a resolution, leaving room for each generation to define freedom in its own image. And so it was that while some Americans saw their country as a beacon of progress and possibility, others saw it as a paradox too painful to ignore. And it was in that paradox where the first fractures began to form, not all at once. It's not in chaos, but in small hesitations, in political debates that never truly ended, in laws passed with reluctance, in glances that carried the weight of centuries. And as the decades wore on, these fractures deepened, silently reshaping the landscape long before a single shot was fired. Slavery was not only an institution, it was a presence that shaped every corner of life, whether directly or by implication. And even in places where its chains were absent, its shadow stretched long, embedded in the economy, in social norms, in the silent complicity of those who benefited indirectly. And so a system that dehumanized millions also numbed the conscience of a nation, allowing people to live beside injustice without seeing it, to walk past suffering with eyes gently closed, to preserve peace by silencing truth. And yet in that silence, resistance grew in stories whispered at night, in escapes plotted beneath stars, in the songs passed from mother to child that held the memory of home and the hope of something more. For those who lived in the South, defense of slavery was often woven into a wider narrative of tradition, of heritage, of economy and identity, a way of life handed down and fiercely guarded, taught, in homes and sermons as natural, divinely ordered, and necessary. While for others abolitionists in the North, free black communities, and the enslaved themselves, it was a moral wound that could not be healed without reckoning. A truth that demanded voice and action, even when doing so meant exile, ridicule, or danger. And in this tension, voices rose, not always loud, but persistent like water slowly carving stone, reshaping the country's soul. Even as tensions built beneath the surface, most Americans continued their lives working, worshiping, falling in love, raising families, and hoping for a future that felt secure and predictable. And yet, like the slow shifting of tectonic plates beneath calm seas, something fundamental was moving, changing, building pressure with each year that passed. And though many people could not name it, they could feel it in the intensity of political discourse, in the growing discomfort with old compromises, in the restless energy of a generation raised in contradiction, and now beginning to ask why things were the way they were, and whether they had to stay that way forever. The 1820s and 1830s saw growing debates over expansion, tariffs, and representation. Each conflict a mask for the deeper issue that pulsed beneath them, all whether the nation could remain whole while embracing two opposing visions of freedom and, though politicians tried to hold the center, to delay the inevitable with legislation and oratory, they were slowly losing their grip on a country that was beginning to see itself more as halves than a whole. And in this slow drift apart, families, friends, even entire states began to quietly choose sides, often without realizing that they were doing so. Drawn by beliefs so deeply held, they felt like truth. As railroads were built and factories grew in the North, the South doubled down on its agricultural identity, defending slavery not only as a right, but as the foundation of their entire existence. And while some Northerners embraced abolition, others feared what its disruption might bring, leading to a nation divided not just geographically, but philosophically, economically, and morally. And in this division, mistrust blossomed like wild ivyslow, quiet and hard to remove, till every compromise felt like a delay, every political deal like a wound dressed too late, and the hope for peaceful resolution began to fade, not with drama, but with weary inevitability. In homes across the country, newspapers were read aloud at breakfast tables, sermons took on sharper tones, and school children recited patriotic verses with uncertain hearts, sensing somehow that the meaning of their flag was shifting, stretching between two interpretations that could not coexist forever. And as these everyday moments unfolded, they became part of the greater narratives, small acts of witnessing, of shaping, of leaning toward what would come next. And though no one could see the full shape of the war to come, the feeling was there, like a weight in the air, a tension that stretched across the land like an invisible thread drawn too tight. And yet, even with so much at stake, the days remained quiet, deceptively normal. And that was perhaps the most haunting part, how ordinary everything seemed in the shadow of what was approaching. How the rhythms of life continued almost undisturbed, as if denial could postpone destiny, as if the slow ticking of the clock could be muffled by distraction, but deep down the country knew, and in the stillness before the storm, there was a collective breath held by millions, a breath filled with memory, fear, defiance, and the unspoken knowledge that something vast and terrible and necessary was drawing near. In that breathless pause before history turns, the past and future seemed to touch, and in those final years before war, the United States stood on that threshold and steady, unresolved and undeniably awake, no longer able to hide from the truth it had long refused to face. And though the war had not yet begun, its story had already started, written not in gunfire but in choices, in silences, and whispered questions passed from heart to heart beneath the surface of a restless, dreaming nation. As the silence of postponement grew too thick to ignore, whispers began to stir in quiet corners of the nation, soft, uncertain at first, like the rustle of wind through brittle leaves, yet gaining strength with each step toward clarity. These whispers were not only political speeches or printed pamphlets, but restless feelings that passed from one person to the next in glances, in questions, in the way someone paused longer than usual at a line in a sermon or a sentence in a book. And these whispers did not roar or threaten, not yet, but they moved always forward, gently disturbing the fragile calm of a country divided not only by geography, but by what it chose to believe about itself. In the parlors of northern cities, in the back rooms of churches, in the basements of homes lit by lantern light and purpose, abolitionist voices began to rise, not with hatred, but with urgent truth, with the steady courage of those who could no longer live peacefully in a nation that refused to see the humanity of all its people. And these voices were not uniform, not always aligned, but they shared a heartbeat, a rhythm of longing for something better, something more just, something that would require sacrifice and pain, but might one day make the country whole in a new way. And as these voices grew, so too did the tension between speaking out and staying safe. Among the enslaved, the whispers were older, deeper, bound into lullabies and stories passed across generations, hidden in plain sight through hymns and coded language, through the stillness of waiting and the fire of hope. And in these songs and dreams, there was a wisdom that knew freedom, not as a distant concept, but as something holy, something already etched into the soul and waiting only for the world to catch up. And even in the harshest conditions, that dream survived, moving quietly from one person to the next like an ember protected in cupped hands, glowing in the dark, daring to believe. Meanwhile, leaders emerged from unexpected places: writers, preachers, teachers, mothers, travelers each carrying a piece of the vision, each lifting their voice not with certainty, but with conviction, knowing that the path ahead would be steep and uncertain, but feeling pulled forward nonetheless, as if history itself had tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Now is the time." And they responded, not always with grand gestures, but with the daily bravery of telling the truth when it was easier not to, of standing tall when silence would have been safer, of reaching across barriers that others had learned to accept as immovable. In southern states, whispers took on a different tone: defensive, proud, wary of change, and fiercely protective of a way of life taught as destiny. And here, too, people spoke in hushed tones about what might come, but with a mixture of fear and defiance, a readiness to protect what they had long claimed as theirs, even if it meant breaking the nation apart to do so. And in these communities, the whispers were not of abolition, but of rights, of sovereignty, of tradition being threatened by outside forces. And it is in this divergence of whispers, one rooted in expansion of justice, the other in preservation of structure, that the storm gathered its truest form. Young people felt the pull of this moment with particular intensity, raised in the paradoxes of their elders, yet dreaming beyond them, questioning what had been handed down as truth and beginning to imagine something different, something freer. And many of them wrote in journals and letters that would one day be studied as echoes of a generation standing at the edge of change, not knowing how or when the world would shift, but sensing intuitively that they would be asked to take part in it. And so even as they worked their daily jobs or walked along dusty roads, they carried within them a growing awareness that history was approaching, and they would have to choose where they stood. In Washington, lawmakers debated louder and longer, each compromise harder to sell than the last, each new attempt at balance revealing just how far apart the two sides had grown. And even those who once believed in unity at all costs began to see that some truths could not be negotiated without losing the soul of the country. And so the halls of power echoed with speeches that were less about policy and more about identity, more about the future shape of the nation than about its present function. And behind every vote, behind every delay, was the steady sound of time running out. In rural towns and growing cities, people read the newspapers with anxious eyes, discussed events over dinner tables and front porches, wondering how close they stood to the fire, and whether the country they had known was slipping into something else, something unfamiliar. And though few wanted war, many could no longer envision peace without first passing through a kind of reckoning, a confrontation of truths long avoided. And in this tension, the whispers became a low hum, vibrating beneath daily life, beneath the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the ringing of church bells, hinting that the world was not as still as it appeared. Poets and preachers began to find language for what others only felt, crafting verses and sermons that gave form to the confusion, the pain, the longing, and the fear, and their words became lanterns, illuminating not only the path ahead but also the weight of the path behind, the legacy of choices made and unmade, the complexity of loving a country that did not yet love all its people equally. And in their words, there was sorrow, but also strength, a sense that while the cost of change would be high, the cost of silence would be higher still. And this idea spread quietly at first, but with the power of something too important to ignore. And so, across fields and towns, within churches and homes, inside minds both weary and wide awake, a quiet shift began to take hold, not a revolution of arms, but of awareness, of awakening to the simple yet radical truth that the nation could not go on as it had without breaking something vital in itself. And these whispers, growing louder now, did not yet know what would come next, but they knew what could no longer remain, and in that knowledge, the first steps were taken on a path that would lead the United States not only into battle, but into a painful, necessary reimagining of who it truly was. As the years passed, and the murmurs turned into movements, the tension that once lived in the background began to seep into the fabric of daily life, no longer hidden in the shadows or softened by hopeful words, but out in the open, woven into politics, commerce, family dinners, and Sunday sermons. And like hairline fractures in a delicate glass pane, these cracks in the Union multiplied silently, sometimes imperceptibly, until suddenly, with the right pressure, they began to spread rapidly across the national conscience, revealing just how fragile the unity truly was beneath its proud exterior. Each new piece of legislation, each federal compromise, was intended to patch the divide, but instead only deepened the underlying wounds. As though trying to heal a fever with a blanket instead of treating its cause, and debates in Congress grew more desperate, or bitter, the speeches longer, the gestures grander, but the trust between regions began to erode. As if the North and South no longer spoke the same emotional language, each side feeling increasingly misunderstood, misrepresented, and betrayed, and in this emotional fog, the nation drifted toward something irreversible. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. The Kansas-Nebraska Atoll bore the illusion of solution. But with each, the cost became heavier. As if each agreement carved out another piece of moral clarity in exchange for temporary calm. And while politicians clung to these measures as lifelines, the people felt the strain, especially those whose very lives were being debated like items in an abstract equation. And for them, compromise felt like betrayal, like the country was bartering away its soul to delay a reckoning that had already begun in the hearts of millions. In border states and new territories, the cracks deepened most visibly, where the question of identity was not settled by history, but by proximity, by conflict, by which side a neighbor chose. And in these contested lands, the air was heavy with uncertainty, with the knowledge that what was once merely political was now deeply personal, and families were split, towns divided, communities forced into silence or rage, and under that pressure new lines were drawn, some literal, others invisible, yet just as cutting in, these lines would define the path to war before a single cannon was fired. Stories from places like Bleeding, Kansas painted a picture not of calm debate, but of bloodshed. Ideological battle already begun long before the official declaration, and in this violence there was a foreshadowing. A chilling sense that the Union was no longer simply strained, it was breaking, and not from one side only, but from both ends, pulled by fear, by righteousness, by legacy and pride, and above all, by an inability to imagine compromise without surrender, a fear that giving an inch meant losing everything, and so each side dug in deeper, and the soil of America grew restless beneath their feet. Newspapers captured the cracks with sharp ink and sharper words, fueling the fire with impassioned editorials, exaggerated headlines, and biased narratives that transformed disagreements into threats, that turned political opponents into enemies, and for many readers, the written word became a lens through which reality was distorted, where fact and feeling blended until the truth itself seemed unstable, and so the very media meant to inform instead fanned the flames of division. And within its pages, the slow unraveling of unity was documented not with alarm, but often with triumph, depending on the bias of the press. Religious communities, too, began to split not over faith, but over how that faith interpreted justice, humanity, and the sanctity of law. And where once shared beliefs united congregations across the nation, now denominations fractured along regional lines, with northern churches embracing abolition and southern ones defending slavery as divinely sanctioned. And in these sacred spaces, where voices once rose in harmony, now discord rang out, and the idea of a moral center to hold the nation together began to crumble under the weight of conflicting truths, each side certain that righteousness was on their side alone. Amid all this, individuals faced personal awakenings, moments of quiet rupture, where what they believed or hoped was no longer enough to silence what they felt deep down. And people who had once remained neutral, or uncertain, or simply weary of conflict, began to take sides, not out of anger but from necessity, as if the nation itself had pushed them to choose. To declare, and in this widespread shift, the cracks widened further, not from hatred alone, but from clarity, from the realization that standing still was no longer possible in a country that refused to do so itself. Economically, divides became more visible as well, the industrial North surging forward with railroads and manufacturing, while the agrarian South held tighter to its plantation system. And these economic models did more than drive productivity. They shaped identities, values, and visions of progress. And each region saw the other not only as different, but as dangerous to its own survival. And so the Union, rather than being a shared dream, became a contested space, a fragile truce stretched thin across competing futures, each unwilling to be eclipsed by the other's ambition. And so, the cracks in the Union were no longer subtle. They were deepening every day, echoed in the halls of power, in the press, in churches and schools, in songs and in silence. And while some still hoped for healing, for some new compromise to stitch the nation together, others had begun to sense that the tier might be too wide. That what had once been a country walking forward as one was now two worlds pulling apart, and with each passing season, the road to reconciliation narrowed, and the quiet air of anticipation thickened into something else, into inevitability. The war did not arrive all at once, but surged like a slow flood, creeping across fields and valleys, threading through towns and cities until every corner of the country began to feel its weight. And with each new day, the lines between ordinary life and the growing conflict blurred a little more, as young men traded pens for rifles, storefronts for barracks, and family hearths for camps under foreign stars. And though many enlisted with songs on their lips and banners flying high, believing in the cause they bore or the glory they imagined, that early fire of certainty would not remain untouched. For the path ahead was not paved with triumph, but with mud and sorrow and sacrifice, and the inferno they entered would burn away illusions faster than it consumed the land. As the first major battles unfolded, names once unknown became etched into the American consciousness with a kind of sacred dread, places like Bull Run and Shiloh. Antietam and Fredericksburg each won a grim milestone, each one a revelation of just how brutal and unrelenting this war would become. And the smoke that rose from those battlefields did not simply mark the end of skirmishes, but signaled the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one where the old codes of chivalry and precision shattered beneath the thunder of cannons and the ceaseless whine of balls, and where the land itself seemed to weep, carved open by trenches and strewn with the silence of the fallen. The soldiers who fought were transformed not only by wounds or victories, but by the act of enduring, of facing days soaked in rain and blood, nights pierced by the cries of the wounded, and endless marches under blistering sun or freezing skies. And in the stillness between orders, when the world quieted just enough for memory and doubt to return, many would close their eyes and search for the sound of home, the creak of a porch step, the smell of bread rising in an oven, the laughter of children chasing fireflies through summer dusk. But those memories grew distant, faint echoes muffled by the roar of war, and in their place rose a deeper resilience, forged not in ideals but in pain, camaraderie, and the sheer will to survive. The inferno consumed not only men and weapons but landscapes and lifeways. Across the South, the terrain changed as farms were trampled, cities shelled, and entire regions reshaped by fire and ruin. Where once stood rows of cotton and quiet villages, now stood smoldering remnants, the air thick with ash and mourning, and the civilians caught in the middle, women, children. The elderly carried burdens that history often fails to weigh, for they too were soldiers of another kind, fighting hunger, displacement, grief, and the unbearable waiting that stretched like an open wound between each letter received and each knock at the door. In the North, the inferno wore different colors, industrial smoke rising from factories converted for war, trains thundering with supplies, the distant hum of a nation mobilizing not just its army but its soul land, while the cities pulsed with energy and purpose. They too bore the cost, as casualty lists lengthened, as hospitals overflowed, as widows donned black and fathers buried sons. And the unity that had seemed so certain at the war's beginning began to fray under the weight of loss, political strife, and the gnawing question of how long the fire could be fed before everything familiar was turned to ash. At the heart of the inferno stood President Lincoln, tall and solemn, warned by the gravity of decisions that no man should bear alone. And in the flicker of candlelight and the cold echo of empty rooms, he wrestled not just with military strategy, but with the soul of the nation itself, knowing that to preserve the Union, to make the sacrifices meaningful, he would have to redefine its very purpose. And in that crucible of fire and reflection, he began to see more clearly that this was not just a war to hold a country together, but a war to transform it, to free it from the chains it had long carried, and in doing so, to give it a truer, more painful kind of birth. Meanwhile, the enslaved people whose lives had long been shackled to the machinery of the Southern economy found themselves on the edge of a profound shift. As the tremors of war reached even the plantations and cabins where freedom had once seemed an impossible dream, and though the inferno brought danger and uncertainty, it also cracked open doors that had never before been ajar. And many walked through those openings with courage, escaping across rivers, through forests, following the whispers of Union soldiers or the stars that guided them northward, and in their footsteps was a quiet revolution, one not yet written into proclamations, but inscribed into the very soil of a divided land. The Emancipation Proclamation, when it came, was not a sudden thunderclap, but a steady flame, lit by the long, slow burn of moral reckoning and strategic necessity. And though it did not free every enslaved person immediately, it shifted the war's center of gravity, declaring to the world that this conflict was no longer just about borders and governance, but about human dignity, about the right to exist as more than property. And for many in the Union Army, black and white alike, that shift became a kind of sacred mission, a purpose worth enduring the horrors of war. And though the inferno still raged, it now burned with a different fire, one of justice and transformation. Yet even amid the rising hopes of emancipation, the suffering did not cease, the battles continued, the dead piled higher, and the nights grew longer. And it became clear that the path through the inferno would not be straight or swift, but winding and bitter, a journey measured not only by victories but by what was lost along the way. And the soldiers who marched into the heart of that fire did so not as heroes untouched by fear, but as weary souls carrying too many names of the fallen, too many ghosts walking beside them, and still they pressed forward, because turning back was no longer an option, and because something larger than themselves was now at stake. And as the war entered its middle years, the inferno had become the new normal. The air smelled of powder and smoke. The horizon flickered with distant flames, and every morning arrived with uncertainty. And yet beneath the horror and weariness, there was a strange kind of clarity emerging, a growing recognition that this fire, though it destroyed much, could also forge something new, something stronger, and perhaps even something beautiful. And in that belief, however fragile, lay the endurance of a nation still searching for its soul, still burning, still becoming, still reaching through fire and blood and sacrifice for the promise it had always claimed, but never fully kept. There are moments in history that unfold not with thunderous force, but with a slow and aching inevitability. Like a storm you can feel long before the clouds appear. Like a breath held too long that finally has to be released. And in those final, fragile months before war officially erupted, the United States stood not in peace but in a strained silence, a kind of waiting that wore on the nerves of a fractured nation, and beneath the outward calm, beneath the stillness of church bells ringing and markets bustling and trains arriving on schedule, there was a growing tremble in the bones of the Republic, a low and steady hum of tension that vibrated through every conversation, every newspaper headline, every quiet pause between words, as if the very air had thickened with something unspoken and irreversible, as if the sky itself knew that fire was coming and had begun to glow faintly with its reflection. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 became the turning point, not only on paper, but in the hearts of millions. And while his voice spoke of unity and his speeches carried the tone of moderation, many in the South saw his rise not as a statesman's ascent, but as a direct threat, a final confirmation that their place in the Union had become untenable. And though Lincoln had not proposed the immediate end of slavery where it already existed, his firm opposition to its expansion into new territories sent a signal that echoed far louder than any law or compromise, the signal that the tide had turned, that the balance so precariously held between North and South, freedom and bondage, had begun to tip in a way that could no longer be controlled or reversed without tearing apart the very fabric of the country. And for those who feared what change might bring, fear soon turned to action. One by one, Southern states convened, deliberated, and seceded not in chaos, but in a chilling sort of order, with official declarations, ornate seals, and solemn oaths, and as each state declared its departure, it felt like watching stars blink out in the night sky, each one removing its light from a shared constellation, till the nation itself seemed to lose its shape. And while some cheered the birth of a new confederacy with the conviction of a righteous cause, others watched in disbelief, as if the map they had studied in school and the flag they had saluted in childhood were now dissolving before their eyes. And this slow unraveling did not bring clarity, only deeper confusion, only more questions about what loyalty meant, what history demanded, what the cost of holding on might truly be, and how many were willing to pay it. And still, amid all the speeches and salutes and bold letters sent between governments, there was the quieter pain that spread like a shadow beneath the surface brothers who stopped writing, friends who crossed the street to avoid one another, congregations that split down the middle, and the soft grief of realizing that something cherished, something deeply American, was slipping away, perhaps forever, and no matter how proudly new flags were waved or old banners defended, no matter how many anthems were sung or pamphlets distributed, there was a kind of sorrow that settled into the bones of the people, a sorrow made of memory and fear, of knowing that the home they had all shared, with its contradictions and its promises, might soon become a battlefield, not just of armies, but of meaning itself. The formation of the Confederate States of America was as much a symbolic break as it was political, a deliberate assertion of a new identity, one carved in resistance, built on the foundation of preserving a way of life that had grown inseparable from the institution of slavery. While its leaders spoke of rights and sovereignty, its constitution bore the unmistakable imprint of its intent, naming and protecting the system that the Union was slowly rejecting, and in Richmond, the new capital. The air carried a strange mixture of excitement and dread, a sense of destiny rising alongside the knowledge that peace was no longer sustainable, and that to claim this new vision of the South would mean defending it, not just with rhetoric, but with blood. Back in Washington, the mood was different, frustrated, disbelieving, almost stunned, as if watching a fire begin to spread from the edges of a cherished document. And though some called for swift action, others clung to the hope that time might heal what politics had ruptured, that the southern states might be coaxed back with a new compromise, a softer touch, a shared appeal to reason. But with every week that passed, with every train that left carrying another delegation of secessionists, the chances of reconciliation slipped further away, like smoke rising through fingers, intangible and vanishing, until even the most optimistic began to sense that something was ending, and whatever came next would not be gentle. The image of Fort Sumter, small, stoic, isolated, loomed large in the national imagination, a lonely Union outpost, surrounded by Confederate forces. Its supply lines dwindling, its soldiers waiting in quiet resolve, and in that stillness was a terrible suspense. As the entire nation seemed to pause, breath caught, heart stilled, wondering when the first blow would come and who would bear its weight. And when it finally arrived in April of 1861, when cannons lit up the sky and shook the harbor with thunder, it was not only a military engagement, it was a signal, a declaration to the world and to the soul of the nation itself that the waiting was over, that the path of war had begun, and there was no turning back. From that moment forward, news moved like wildfire, telegraphs clicking, papers printing, crowds gathering around bulletin boards. And the emotion was not uniform, not simple. Some cheered, some wept, some sat down in stunned silence, unable to fully process what this meant for their futures. And in both North and South, something shifted on a deeper level, a kind of waking dream where the familiar became strange, and everything once taken for granted now felt fragile, breakable, and charged with consequence. And while leaders gave speeches and soldiers mustered, ordinary people packed bags, wrote final letters, lit lamps in dark kitchens, and tried to make sense of what had begun. Farms and factories transformed overnight. Plows gave way to bayonets, looms to uniforms, barns to barrack sand. The rhythm of daily life was reshaped by the new reality, as communities adjusted to rationing, to drills, to farewells whispered at train stations, and as families gathered around hearths to read letters or listen for the return of footsteps. There was a collective ache that settled into the body of the country, a slow mourning, not just for what was lost, but for what would be required. And though no one knew the full price, There was a deepening awareness that the fire on the horizon was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it would touch everyone in time. And so, as the sky darkened and spring deepened into summer, the nation stood engulfed in a strange glow, yet full flame, but not far from eye-tanned, in that liminal space between what had been and what would be. The United States became something suspended, not wholly broken, not yet reborn, and it is in that stillness, in that breath before the blaze, that we find ourselves tonight, listening to the quiet footsteps of history drawing near, knowing that soon the fire will rise, that the night will be pierced by gunfire and grief, and yet, for this moment, we remain here together, suspended in the hush, wrapped in the warmth of story, drifting slowly into sleep as the shadows lengthen and the embers begin to stir. The war, once a blaze of motion and sound, now settled into a heavy stillness that blanketed the land like fog, thick and clinging, muting the senses and stretching time into something unfamiliar. And though battles still erupted with sudden violence, it was the days in between the long marches, the endless campfires, the weary silences that came to define this chapter of the conflict. And in that lull between fury, soldiers grew older in ways not measured by birthdays, their faces weathered by cold winds and harder thoughts, their eyes holding the reflection of things too difficult to name, and yet still they rose each morning, boots caked in mud, shoulders aching, hearts tethered not to glory but to duty, memory, and a dream that had not yet died. Letters from home arrived less frequently now, or carried news that bent the spirit of missing harvests, of sickness spreading through towns, of brothers fallen and fathers lost. Each envelope was a double-edged gift, both a thread of connection and a wound reopened. And for many who clutched those pages in trembling hands beneath flickering lanterns, the words blurred into questions unspoken. Would they make it back? Would there still be a home to return to? Would they still be themselves when it was over? And in that quiet uncertainty, the shadow grew, not as a storm, but as a slow, unrelenting dusk. The long shadows stretched across the minds of generals and soldiers alike, creeping into decisions, altering strategies, haunting dreams, and in some camps, laughter grew rarer, replaced by the sound of coughing, of prayers whispered over the dying, of boots crunching frost as men buried their comrades in hastily dug graves beneath indifferent stars, and even victories began to taste like ash. For each one came at a price counted not in maps gained, but in lives spent, and the question that once had clarity, what are we fighting for, now wavered in the smoke, elusive and aching, like a song half forgotten. For the enslaved and newly freed, the shadow bore a different weight. Freedom had been declared but not yet delivered in full, and the path forward was lined with uncertainty, hostility, and the lingering chains of a country not yet ready to release its old ghosts. And though many black men joined the Union Army, fighting with courage that reshaped the tide of war, they still faced suspicion, unequal pay, and brutality from friend and foe alike, and yet their march was resolute, their steps a drumbeat of transformation, and in every act of defiance, every gesture of dignity reclaimed, the shadow trembled just slightly, challenged by the light of something new. In the cities and towns far from the front, the war lingered not as gunfire, but as absence. As altered rhythms of daily life, women took over farms and shops, children matured too quickly, and communities learned to mourn together in ways they never had before. And each morning, the toll of church bells might signal a marriage or a death, but both carried the same undercurrent. Life had become fragile, urgent, and precious. And even the simplest rituals, baking bread, mending a shirt, sweeping a porch, took on a reverent quality, as if by holding on to the familiar, they could hold back the tide of everything else that was changing. Political debates raged in Congress and in taverns, at dinner tables, and in newspaper editorials. As the public wrestled with growing disillusionment, and though Lincoln still stood as a solemn pillar at the heart of the storm, even he was not immune to doubt or despair. And in private moments, he paced the halls of the White House, haunted by the decisions he had made, by the names he could not forget, and by the knowledge that each signature, each speech, each command sent ripples through thousands of lives, and yet he pressed forward, guided not by certainty, but by something quieter and deeper, belief in the possibility of redemption, not just for the Union, but for its very soul. The wounded returned from battle with limbs missing, eyes blind, lungs damaged by smoke and disease. And the hospitals crowded, makeshift, and echoing with pain became places not only of healing, but of reckoning, where bodies and minds bore testimony to the cost of ideals, and where nurses, many of them women with no formal training, became the quiet heroes of the home front, their hands steady through exhaustion, their presence a balm in a world unraveling. And through their care, the war's shadow was pushed back, if only for a moment, by tenderness and compassion undimmed by horror. In poetry and song, the war found new voices, some mournful, some defiant, some yearning for peace. And these words, carried on paper and wind, became a parallel battlefield, a place where hope and sorrow could coexist, where soldiers could remember who they were beneath the uniform, and where citizens could grapple with the magnitude of what their country was enduring. And though not all verses were published, not all songs sung aloud, their very creation was resistance against silence, against forgetting, against the numbing weight of a war that seemed to have no end. As the seasons turned, so did the hearts of many, and a kind of collective fatigue settled over the land. It's not just of the body, but of the spirit, and it became clear that there would be no clean conclusion. It's no triumphant finale untouched by grief, and that even if the Union prevailed, it would emerge from the fire transformed, marked forever by what it had endured. And the question would no longer be just how to win, but how to rebuild, how to forgive, how to remember without being destroyed by memory. And in that reckoning, the long shadow would linger, a reminder of the darkness traversed, and the light still to be claimed. And still, in the hush before each dawn, across fields blanketed in frost or dew, soldiers lay awake in tents and trenches, listening to the breathing of their comrades, the occasional whinny of a distant horse, the rustle of wind in bare branches. And in that stillness, some prayed, some wept, and some simply stared upward, tracing constellations that seemed to promise something ancient and enduring. And perhaps in those moments they understood what the war could never take, that even in the longest night, the stars remained, and in the quiet resilience of that truth, they found the strength to face another day. There came a moment, subtle at first and unnoticed by many, when the winds seemed to shift ever so slightly, not in the roar of cannon fire nor in grand declarations, but in the quiet confidence of those who had survived so much, who had held their ground through long months of doubt and blood. And this change, fragile and tremulous, emerged not as triumph, but as the soft turning of a tide, as if the current beneath the chaos had decided to lean gently in a new direction. And though the waves of war still crashed loudly on every shore, something deeper had begun to realign beneath the surface of the nation's spirit. The Union, battered but unbroken, found in its people a renewed endurance. And it was not just in the strategies of generals or the movement of regiments, but in the resilience of blacksmiths who worked through the night to supply arms, in the quiet labor of freedmen building new lives with hands calloused by bondage, in the eyes of nurses who refused to falter, and in the breath of mothers who whispered hope into letters sent across the country. And this collective pulse, made of countless small acts of perseverance, slowly began to shape the momentum of the war, like a river shifting its course by the persistence of falling rain. On the battlefields, victories were no longer isolated flickers, but part of a slow and accumulating rhythm. As the Union began to reclaim key positions, town by town, rail by rail, and each step forward, while soaked in sacrifice, began to weave together a fragile sense that perhaps the end was not a fantasy, that maybe beyond the haze and thunder there lay something more than endless struggle. And though the path ahead remained shadowed, there was a growing awareness, tentative but real, that they were not lost, that their direction, at last, might be leading them toward light rather than deeper into night. At sea, the Union blockade tightened its grip, a silent, strangling hand that choked the lifelines of the Confederacy, cutting off trade, starving supply lines, and isolating the South in slow, relentless pressure. And though this kind of warfare lacked the drama of battlefield charges, its impact was profound. As hunger and scarcity eroded morale and weakened resolve, and it was here, in the quiet attrition of blockade and encirclement, that another kind of war was won not with rifles, but with patience and precision, with the discipline to wait, as the tide slowly, inevitably turned. And still within the heart of the South, dissent stirred like embers beneath ash, as those weary of war soldiers and civilians alike began to question the cause that had once felt so righteous. And desertions increased, whispers of peace grew bolder, and the illusion of unity within the Confederacy began to fray, thread by thread, until even the proudest began to admit, if only in secret, that the dream might be crumbling, that the sacrifices made could not always be justified, and that the cost, once noble, was now bleeding into something hollow and unanswerable. Lincoln, ever solemn and weighted with the enormity of leadership, began to speak not just of victory, but of reconciliation, planting seeds of a future where the wounds of the nation might begin to heal. And his words, carefully chosen, grave yet merciful, began to shape the national imagination toward something beyond vengeance, toward restoration. And though his vision was not always welcomed, and though the war still raged, his voice became a compass for those who had begun to imagine a future, stitched together not by force, but by fragile human hope. Among the ranks, a new wave of resolve surged as African-American regiments proved their valor again and again, not only in acts of bravery under fire, but in their unshakable belief that their fight was for more than victory. It was for dignity, for justice, for the full recognition of their humanity, and, in the echo of their steps, marching through towns that had once enslaved them, there was a powerful statement that this war, no matter its cost, would forever change the soul of the nation. For these men were not just soldiers, they were living declarations of freedom, and their presence on the battlefield tilted the moral axis of the conflict itself. In the North, war-weariness gave way to a quiet but growing pride, a sense that perhaps the long suffering had not been in vain, and though grief still hovered in every home touched by loss, there was a cautious readiness to believe again, to believe in country, in the slow justice of perseverance, in the vision of a union restored and reborn, and towns once draped in mourning began to lift their eyes toward the future, not with jubilation but with steady breath, as if a nation learning once more how to breathe. Even nature seemed to respond, as spring thawed, frozen fields once tread by soldiers, and flowers bloomed where blood had soaked the ground. And though the past could not be undone, and though ghosts would always remain, there was something healing in the cycles that refused to stop, in the wind that kept moving, in the light that returned each morning despite the sorrow it revealed. And it was in these rhythms, timeless and tender, that many found the strength to hope again, not blindly, but with a kind of hope born from deep knowing, from having faced the worst and still choosing to dream. And so, the tide continued to turn, not in a single moment of glory, but in 1,000 unseen shifts, in the joining of voices long silenced, the bending of stubborn will towards something softer. And as the war moved closer to its end, those who had lived through it began to understand that what they had endured would shape not only their present, but the generations yet to come. And in this realization there was both gravity and grace, for in turning the tide, they were not only altering history, they were becoming it. War had left the land fractured in ways that maps could never show. And though the boundaries between North and South remained drawn by ink and history, the deeper divides lived in the hearts of its people, etched in silence and distrust, in sorrow too vast for language. And as soldiers returned to soil that no longer felt familiar, they carried with them the weight of all they had seen. And that burden reshaped the contours of farms, towns, and cities alike, not through architecture but through absence, through a grief that settled over rooftops like ash, fine and invisible, yet impossible to wipe clean. Fields once golden with wheat now lay choked with weeds, furrowed by the heavy tread of boots and cannon wheels. And the farmers who stood again on that soil did so with hands calloused from rifle barrels rather than plows, unsure of where to begin, unsure if anything could ever grow in ground that had soaked up so much blood. And yet they tried, not because they believed in certainty, but because they understood that to dig, to plant, to tend, was to whisper to the future, to dare it to come closer even while the past clung like fog to their shoulders. Cities scarred by fire rose from rubble with hesitant ambition, their bricks laid not only with mortar, but with memory, every wall a testament to what had been lost. And those who rebuilt did so with trembling resolve. For they knew that homes could be mended faster than trust, that the hardest thing to restore was not wood or stone, but the feeling of safety, of belonging, of peace. And so the hammering of nails became a kind of prayer, each strike against timber a vow to reclaim something human in a world still echoing with the roar of cannons and the cries of the dying. Among the ruins, families reassembled themselves like shattered porcelain. Missing pieces, edges worn, bonds cracked but not wholly broken, and in their reunions there was joy, yes, but also guilt and confusion. How do you hold someone who has seen such horror, who has become someone else entirely while you waited at a window, watching for shadows, listening for silence in those embraces? There was often more trembling than triumph, more tears than words, for grief had changed them all, and the comfort of touch had to be relearned, slow and uncertain. The freedmen walked roads unfamiliar, not because they had never seen them, but because for the first time they walked without chains, without owners, and yet without the promised clarity of freedom, and each step into the open air was both liberation and trial. For the world beyond the plantation did not welcome them with open arms, but with suspicion, with laws disguised as mercy, with systems designed to cage the body in new ways, and still they moved forward, slow and steady, because stillness had never been a choice. And hope, fragile, flickering, had become its own kind of compass. Women who had held families together while the war swallowed their husbands. Sons and brothers now found themselves caught between roles, no longer the silent support, but not yet fully seen as part of the nation's reconstruction, and in their quiet labor, in their long nights over ledgers, looms and letters, they rewove the fabric of communities, their grief turned into endurance, their mourning into action, and though history would often forget their names, their hands left fingerprints on every wall, every cradle, every schoolhouse, building a future even as they carried the weight of the war's unspoken toll. In churches and schools, people gathered not only to learn or pray, but to feel less alone, to sit in the same air and know that others, too, carried the heaviness. And in those moments of shared breath, of murmured hymns and hesitant recitations, something tender began to stir, not healing, not yet, but a willingness to imagine that healing might be possible, and that possibility, faint as the sound of wind and leaves, offered a kind of warmth, a reminder that while the land had broken, the human spirit, though bent and battered, still leaned toward the light. Letters written from makeshift desks and broken porches became lifelines between past and future. Each word a thread spun across distance and doubt, and those who wrote did so with trembling hands, pouring into ink all the things they couldn't say aloud, the faces they couldn't forget, the dreams that still returned in sleep, the bitterness that crept in like ivy, and still they wrote, because writing meant remembering, and remembering, however painful, meant refusing to let the dead vanish, refusing to let the war end without witness, without testimony. Children born in the shadow of war played among ruins they couldn't yet understand, their laughter echoing oddly against crumbled walls. And in their games of soldiers and flags, of hiding and running, they carried unknowingly the echoes of battles fought long before their names were spoken. And yet their innocence glimmered like dew on scorched ground, a softness that defied the ruin. A small and stubborn declaration that life, no matter how fractured, would not be silenced, that even in brokenness, something beautiful could take root and rise. And beneath it all, the land itself breathed, scarred but alive. The rivers still winding, the trees still stretching upward, and the sky still vast and indifferent. And in that endless turning of seasons, there was a lesson that people came to feel in their bones, that nothing, not even the deepest wound, is final. And that in the quiet work of planting, of rebuilding, of forgiving, a different kind of strength could be found. Not the fierce fire of battle, but the slow, steady glow of resilience. And in that glow, the shattered grounds began to pulse once more with the quiet rhythm of life. The final echoes of war rarely arrive with fanfare or clarity, and in the case of the American Civil War, they drifted slowly across battle-scarred landscapes like smoke that refused to lift, curling through the remnants of shattered towns, over the graves of the fallen, and through the hearts of the living who remained behind to gather what they could from the silence. The guns may have quieted, but in that quiet was not peace, only the vast and aching pause between devastation and recovery, a fragile stillness that trembled beneath the weight of memory and mourning, as the air itself seemed reluctant to believe the fighting had ceased. All around the country, people emerged from the fog of conflict, blinking into the light of something unfamiliar, a world where nothing was quite as it had been, and everything now had a crack running through it. In the South, the surrender of Confederate forces did not erase the loss etched into the land, or the identities undone by defeat. The once proud plantations stood ghostly and still. Many of them burned or abandoned, their fields untended, and their grand halls hollow with absence. Those who had built lives on the foundation of a system now abolished wandered the ruins of their certainty, grappling with bitterness, shame, and fear of a future in which they no longer held the reins. Their grief was complicated, twisted with the remnants of power and privilege, and in their silence there were questions that echoed too loudly in the minds of those unready to answer them. Meanwhile, for the newly freed, the dawn of liberation was both brilliant and blinding. A moment of long-awaited truth wrapped in uncertainty. Freedom, after all, was not a destination but a beginning, and those who stepped into this uncharted space did so without maps, without protection, and often without shelter. They carried with them the weight of generations who had dreamed of this moment, and they moved forward cautiously, finding strength in each other and in the quiet hope that even scorched ground could bloom again. Churches became meeting places not only for prayer but for strategy, for schooling, for community. Songs once whispered in the fields now rang out with pride and pain, both a lament for what was lost and a proclamation of what might still be. In the North, there was relief, but it was not unclouded. The price of victory had been steep, countless lives, shattered families, and a nation still frayed at the seams. The parades that marked the end of the war were not immune to the presence of the wounded, the limbless, the hollow-eyed. Returning soldiers bore their own scars, some visible, some buried so deep they surfaced only in the stillness of night, in the dreams that turned to ash before morning. And in the cities, life pressed on with a strange urgency, as if by moving faster, people might outrun the ghosts that walked among them. The political landscape was uncertain, trembling under the weight of reconstruction. Leaders debated not just how to rebuild, but who would have the power to shape that rebuilding. In the capital, there were speeches and documents and plans, but in the countryside, it was fences being mended, roofs being patched, graves being dug, and crops being planted in weary soil. The work of peace, it turned out, was not grand or ceremonious. It was slow and uneven, and often invisible. It was found in hands clasped in cautious agreement, in the first shared meal between former enemies, in the soft lullaby of a mother who had no more sons to sing to, but still found herself humming as if to call back the lost. And even as the war drew to a close, its aftershocks pulsed outward, reshaping not only the land but the very consciousness of those who had lived through it. The way people spoke changed, the way they prayed, the way they remembered and forgot. Cemeteries expanded like new cities, and memorials began to rise. Stone and metal stitched into the landscape as if to make sense of the chaos. But no monument could hold all the names, and no book could contain the entirety of the ache. The past pressed forward with a quiet insistence, asking to be witnessed, asking to be felt. Among the soldiers who survived, stories were passed like sacred relics, and silence was sometimes the only way they knew to honor the fallen. Around campfires and dinner tables, some spoke in fragments of moments when time stood still, or of voices that called out and never answered. Others never spoke at all, choosing instead to carry their memories privately, tucked deep beneath layers of daily life.
Ow.
Their wounds were stitched, not only in skin, but in trust, in faith, the delicate thread of hope that refused to break even when stretched to near invisibility. The land itself bore scars that would take generations to heal. Forests had been stripped, rivers muddied, towns erased or changed beyond recognition. Yet slowly, tenderly, nature began to reclaim what had been scorched. Green shoots pushed through the blackened earth, wildflowers bloomed where cannons had once rolled, and birds returned to sing in trees that had stood as silent sentinels to violence. There was something in the rhythm of the natural world, a quiet resilience, a cyclical trust and renewal that offered a kind of comfort no speech or policy ever could. In homes across the country, families adjusted to new absences, 2 empty chairs at tables, 2 letters reread until the ink wore thin. Children asked questions that had no easy answers, and parents searched for stories that might soothe the ache of not knowing. Grief settled into the cracks of daily life like a second skin, familiar and constant, but not without light. In lullabies and bedtime tales, in whispered blessings and soft goodnights, there was an effort to pass forward something gentler, promise that, though the world had burned, love had not turned to ash. And so the war ended, not with finality, but with a soft unraveling, a slow letting go. Its echoes lingered in the quiet spaces, in the sighs before sleep, in the distant rumble of thunder that sounded too much like cannon fire. But beneath all that, something small and steady pulsed a wish, a question, a hope. That maybe, just maybe, from all this ruin, something whole might rise again. Not what was before, but something better. And in that thought, held gently in the dark, a nation wounded, weary, and waking, breathed in and waited. In the tender hush that followed the war's end, the most profound moments did not take place in grand halls or public ceremonies, but in kitchens and parlors, on porches at dusk, and in fields where hands once toiled under a master's shadow and now reached out with cautious grace. The reunions came not with spectacle, but with small, trembling gestures. The door opened slowly. A name whispered into the stillness, a pair of eyes searching a familiar face, made unfamiliar by time, by loss, by the scars left behind. These moments carried a weight that could not be spoken aloud, and in their quiet unfolding they offered a fragile kind of hope, as if love, long buried under rubble and grief, could rise again in silence. Families, once scattered by war, found each other again in fragments. Letters that had crossed the country on tattered paper now became touchstones, read aloud by candlelight as voices cracked with disbelief and relief. A brother once presumed dead stood barefoot in a doorway, too thin and too changed, and yet more beloved than ever. A mother clutched her child not with joy alone, but with the fear that such joy might shatter if held too tightly. The war had altered everyone. No one returned untouched, but within the tremble of these reunions, there was a recognition that life, though broken, still pulsed beneath the surface. Some returns were met not with open arms, but with silence and distance. Time had forged chasms between those who stayed and those who fought, between those who lost sons and those who survived. The awkwardness of rebuilding trust, of finding words for things too heavy to say, became part of the new rhythm of daily life. In some homes, conversations began again only through the labor of shared chores, mending clothes, chopping wood, feeding chickens as, if the language of healing was found in quiet work and the steady presence of one another. There was no guide for this kind of return, no script for rebuilding love after so much absence, only the slow and uncertain steps toward being whole again. For those who had escaped bondage, reunions were bittersweet, full of both triumph and sorrow. Some found loved ones after years apart, their voices cracked with emotion. Their names called out across dusty roads like prayers returned to the living. Others found only memories, graves unmarked, or faces lost forever to the wind. Still, there was power in seeking, in walking free under the sky and calling out to those who might yet answer. These were reunions of the soul, as much as of the body declarations, not just of family, but of survival, of dignity reclaimed, of a bond unbroken, even by chains. In small towns and countryside churches, gatherings slowly returned, not just for worship, but for remembering, for naming the lost, for holding space for grief and gratitude alike. The pews held veterans with downturned eyes, mothers with folded hands, children who now knew more than they should. The hymns took on a new kind of gravity, each note a thread connecting the past to something gentler ahead. And in the pauses between verses, in the collective breath of a room learning to breathe again, there was comfort, not in certainty, but in presence, in the quiet knowing that they had all walked through fire and were still standing. Even the land seemed to exhale. Where once fields had trembled under cannon fire, now the soil welcomed seeds again. Farmers returned to the rhythms of planting and harvesting, their hands both calloused and reverent, aware of what the earth had witnessed and what it still held. The seasons continued their steady rotation, as if to remind the people that time did not stop for grief, but neither did it erase it. Each sunrise brought not a forgetting but a layering of memory, of labor, of the sacred ordinariness of life returned. There was healing in the repetition, in the turning of soil, in the baking of bread, in the rocking of a child to sleep. Friendships, too, found their way back through gentleness. Men who had once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield now passed one another in markets and crossroads, eyes lowered but not always with bitterness. In some cases, hands were offered, tentatively, humbly across divides, not to forget, but to acknowledge. It was not forgiveness that came first, but the recognition of shared survival. They were all, in some way, carriers of sorrow, and in that sorrow was the possibility of peace. Not a peace declared by governments, but one whispered between neighbors, built moment by moment through patience and restraint. Children born into the aftermath did not yet carry the weight of what had come before, but they absorbed it through lullabies, through the quiet gestures of adults who no longer raised their voices, through the way stories were told or left untold. They learned to play in yards where soldiers once marched, to ask questions that made their elders pause, to draw pictures of homes mended and skies unbroken. Their laughter, light and unburdened, became the truest song of return. It drifted through windows and across porches, a reminder that life, for all its sorrow, insisted on blooming again. In many homes, the walls held silence where names once echoed daily. Some chairs would never be filled again. And yet, on those tables, meals were still served, prayers still said, letters still written. The act of living became its own quiet rebellion against despair. People hung photographs, planted flowers, stitched quilts, and told stories not only of war, but of love, of kindness, of small mercies that had somehow endured. They gathered for weddings, for births, for dances lit by lanterns, allowing joy to return in cautious steps, in the understanding that joy was not the absence of sorrow, but its companion. And so the reunions continued not as singular events, but as a long unfolding of reconnection, of hearts slowly finding their rhythm again. They were not always happy, nor always complete, but they were real, they were tender. And in their quietness, they carried the deepest truth of all, that even after a storm that split a nation, even after the flames and the smoke and the graves, love could still gather its scattered pieces and come home. Not perfect, not unscarred, but present. Still here, still reaching out in the dark. Thank you for wandering with me through this quiet retelling of a time when the world trembled, when hearts cracked open and hands reached out through smoke and sorrow to find one another again. The story of the Civil War is not only one of battles and declarations, it is a story of people, of voices once silenced and then heard, of small kindnesses blooming in broken fields, of reunion and reckoning, of letting go and learning to hold on differently. As you drift now into the comfort of rest, let your thoughts float gently through the fading echoes of this journey. Feel the hush of the night gather softly around you, like the arms of someone long missed, now returned. Let the images dissolve, the flicker of lanterns, the rustle of uniforms laid to rest, the quiet laughter of children learning to dream again. Let them fade not with sorrow, but with gratitude, knowing that even the darkest hours can give way to peace, that even torn maps can be redrawn with gentler hands. Breathe in slowly, letting the stillness settle over your chest like warm linen. Breathe out all the heaviness, all the tension, all the names and dates and weight of memory. There is no need to remember everything now. Only the feeling remains, the echo of resilience, the whisper of love enduring, the rhythm of footsteps returning home. The night holds you now. Let it. You are safe here, wrapped in the softness of stories where no cannon roars, no ground shakes. Only the quiet hum of time passing, of lives remembered, of peace at last, returning not with fanfare, but with gentleness. Sleep, dear listener, knowing that even the hardest chapters can lead us toward healing. Sleep with the knowledge that history, though heavy, can be held with tenderness. And as your breath deepens and your thoughts become softer, may you feel accompanied not by the noise of the past, but by its silence, transformed into something soothing and still. Thank you for listening. Thank you for resting with me. I'll be here whenever you wish to return. Till then, sleep well, dream deeply, and let the night carry you gently into morning.